A Tennessee community is shocked when a beloved elderly woman vanishes. As investigators search, the mystery of her disappearance deepens. The truth begins to emerge, but slowly and in unexpected directions. As police and the FBI try to help a troubled small town find their dear friend.
In 1992, a woman disappeared from her Memphis home. When the ransom went uncollected, the FBI suspected a desperate amateur and feared the worst. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. As the search for the woman progressed, investigators uncovered a web of lies and false accusations designed to hide the real perpetrator.
Memphis, Tennessee. On August 7th, 1992, 25 miles outside the city in the small town of Eads, successful land developer Alan Roberts arrived home from work. As usual, his wife's car was in the driveway, but he was surprised to find the mail there.
Doe?
His wife, Doe Roberts, usually left a note when she went out, but there was none.
Doe?
In the kitchen, Alan spotted Doe's asthma medication on the counter. She always took the inhaler when she went out. He called their closest friends nearby.
Bill? Yeah, Bill, this is Alan. Have you seen Doe today? Has she been over there?
No one he spoke to had heard from Doe.
Still not here. I'm a little bit worried, okay? I'll tell you what, I'm going to go out and look around the property for her. You do me a favor, call around and see if you can find her, okay? Hello?
Roberts worried she might have had an asthma attack while working in the garden. He searched the grounds of their farm. No sign of Doe.
Doe? Doe?
He was about to call the police when his telephone rang.
Hello, Doe?
It was a man speaking with an Asian accent.
You have Doe? What do you mean you have Doe? What do you want?
The caller demanded a $100,000 ransom for Doe's safe return.
Not a problem. I can take care of it. It'll take me a little time. You just let me know what you want me to do and I'll do it, okay?
But he didn't explain where to take the money.
Where do you want me to take it?
Before he hung up.
Hello?
Stunned, Alan immediately called the Shelby County Sheriff's Department and told them about his wife's disappearance and the ransom call he received. A team of deputies and sheriff's inspectors responded to the house. Roberts told them he did not recognize the voice of the caller and did not know anyone who would want to harm Doe.
I came back home then about 7:30, 8 o'clock.
As the interview continued, agents from the FBI's Memphis field office arrived. Eads is about 30 miles from both the Arkansas and Mississippi borders. If someone took Doe across state lines, the FBI would take the lead, since transporting a victim state to state is a federal crime. Roberts explained he last saw his wife that morning.
So you're planning on working in the
They had
garden
eaten
today?
breakfast together, as they had every morning for 43 years.
Yes, I am. I hope it's not too hot to work.
At 10, Alan left to meet a prospective out-of-town buyer for a property he was developing.
See you later.
All right, have a good day.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
The buyer, a man named Sam Wagner, had called the day before, making an appointment to see the property at 10:30 that morning.
Morning, Todd.
Robert said he waited for over an hour, but Sam Wagner never showed.
Seemed like
He spent the rest of the afternoon laying sod at another of his development properties.
Sure, yeah. You want to? Okay, we're coming this way.
The investigators needed to check the house for evidence. Robert showed them Doe's asthma inhaler and said if she suffered a serious attack without it, she could die. They needed to find her immediately. Looking for signs of forced entry, deputies checked doors and windows. Nothing appeared suspicious.
Is it locked?
Knowing that people sometimes run off voluntarily, faking abductions to cover themselves, deputies checked Doe's bedroom. Her suitcases and all of her clothing were still there, as were her valuables. It didn't seem like she left on her own. If someone had abducted her, one clue suggested it happened outside, according to FBI Special Agent Joanne Overall.
Alan Roberts located mail halfway into the garage, and it was not taken into the house. He suspected that his wife had gone to the mailbox and never made it back into the house, and she had laid the mail down at that point.
Beginning at the driveway, deputies formed search lines, fanning out in a grid pattern to scour the 150-acre farm for any sign of the 65-year-old woman, or what happened to her. Despite the efforts of multiple search teams, they found nothing. The best chance for a new lead would be additional ransom calls.
Got this hooked up. When he called,
We began monitoring Alan Roberts' phone right after the kidnapping. With his consent, we placed a recorder on his phone should he get a call from the kidnapper.
recording when the phone rings.
They also installed tracing equipment.
Leave it down the whole time you're talking. When you finish, push the
If the man with the Asian accent called again, the FBI would be ready. Later that night, the phone rang.
Hello? Yes?
It was coming from a nearby payphone.
No, just don't hurt her. I'll do whatever you want.
Deputies headed toward the source of the call.
Okay,
It sounded like the same man who called earlier.
okay.
He said Doe was safe, for now, and he knew law enforcement was listening. Robert said the caller ordered him to remove the tape of their conversation and crush it in the driveway.
He wants me to take it outside and smash it. He said he's gonna be watching.
They quickly switched it with a blank tape.
All right, go out there and crush it, and I'll watch it.
Oh, okay.
At that time, no surveillance officers were outside. When Shelby County deputies arrived at the payphone, it was clear. Whoever made the call was gone. By daybreak, investigators expanded their search into the Eads community, asking friends and neighbors when they last saw Doe and if they noticed anything unusual on the day of her disappearance.
Doe and Alan Roberts.
Yeah, sure. They live right over there.
No one recalled seeing or hearing from her that day.
Yes, sir?
One neighbor told investigators that at church that week, there seemed to be tension between Doe and Alan. But no solid clues emerged. Word of the kidnapping spread, and news stations picked up the story. Joe Birch of WMC-TV in Memphis reported on the small community's reaction to Doe's disappearance.
A lot of people felt it must have been someone from the outside who committed this crime. Because these people worshiped together, they went to square dances together, they spent a lot of their time together, and their focus was their little community and staying away from downtown Memphis and all the danger that might be here. So I think the people in the Eads community felt like an outsider probably committed this crime.
But investigators wondered how, in a place like Eads, a stranger wasn't noticed. As the investigation's first full day drew to a close, Special Agent Overall's concern grew. The 24 hours immediately following a kidnapping are critical. As more time passes, the chances of finding the victim alive diminish rapidly. On the second day, community members gathered to show their support and offer prayers for Doe's safe return. While the town of Eads prayed, investigators turned their attention to the most likely suspect.
In a case like this, we always look at the family members and relatives, people that are closest to the victim first, and then work the circle outwards.
They needed to start with the husband, Alan Roberts. It was possible he had harmed Doe, then used an accomplice to make the ransom calls. It is always difficult when family members realize they are suspects. Authorities had to ask the worried husband to take a polygraph test. It was an unexpected request, but Alan agreed. A polygraph measures a subject's physiological reactions while answering questions. The subject reviews all of the questions before the test, so there are no surprises. Though commonly called a lie detector test, a polygraph does not actually detect lies. It only detects whether the subject is exhibiting the characteristics most people exhibit when lying: spikes in heart rate, perspiration, blood pressure, and respiration.
Are you convinced that I will only ask you questions that we've gone over before?
While polygraph results are rarely admissible in court, many investigators find they point them in the right direction.
Is your first name Alan?
The examiner asked Roberts questions unrelated to the case to establish a baseline for truthful responses. Then he asked questions about his relationship with Doe and the events of the day she disappeared.
Did you kill Doe Roberts?
The examiner then interpreted the graphic output to determine if Roberts appeared to be deceptive on the questions about the case.
All right.
In his opinion, Alan Roberts answered all of the questions truthfully. Alan was sure this was the end of it. But agents knew that test results were not always accurate. They could not eliminate him yet. To check Roberts' story, the FBI wanted to find Sam Wagner, the man he allegedly went to meet on the morning of Doe's abduction.
We thought Sam Wagner may have come into this area, and because of their financial backings and holdings, that he may have kidnapped Doe Roberts for the money that they had, because they had a substantial amount of money.
Agents checked FBI databases and nationwide DMV records, searching for anyone named Sam Wagner. In several states, FBI agents interviewed men of that name, but eliminated each as a suspect.
Alan Roberts' story became more suspicious when Sam Wagner became an unknown individual that we couldn't locate, and it became more apparent to us that Alan Roberts could possibly be behind the kidnapping.
Looks like he checks out. I don't think he's going to take
If Alan did do something to his wife, perhaps the couple's phone records and banking statements would reveal a clue.
There's nothing unusual about any of the phone calls.
Yet investigators uncovered only evidence of a normal life spent in a small town, with no sign of contact with anyone suspicious, and no record of Doe spending money after August 7th. No leads were panning out. Eventually, they came to believe Doe Roberts was dead.
After approximately 2 to 3 weeks of being unable to locate the victim, it was more than likely going to end up being a homicide. I requested through my supervisor that we bring in Shelby County Sheriff's Department into the investigation to make it a joint investigation.
If it were a murder, it would be prosecuted in state court. The team returned to the Roberts house.
The second search of Alan Roberts' property was done more in a forensic frame of mind, and we were looking for blood spatterings in the house as well as in the barn.
Again, Roberts cooperated. He would do anything. Forensics technicians from the FBI and the Sheriff's Department processed the buildings, looking for any evidence of a murder, cleanup, or disposal of a body. They also gathered hairs and carpet fibers from Alan's truck to compare to any evidence recovered later. The painstaking search lasted 2 full days. Alan Roberts grew more frustrated that law enforcement had to devote so much time to him as a suspect. He was wearing down, and the real kidnapper was out there, somewhere. In 1992, the Shelby County Sheriff's Department and the Memphis FBI searched Alan Roberts' farm and its buildings for any sign of his wife's possible murder. Roberts had passed a polygraph, and now none of the items on his property tested positive for blood. Yet no other suspects emerged, and investigators had developed circumstantial evidence that implicated Roberts. Although several witnesses had seen Roberts that day, his confirmed alibi only accounted for about 5 hours. Authorities knew that left plenty of time to get rid of a body. Also, some members of the Eads community gave statements claiming Alan Roberts had acted in a suspicious manner following Doe's disappearance, according to Special Agent Joanne Overall.
People within the community felt he did not openly grieve for the loss of his wife. He was socializing shortly after her kidnapping, that both him and his wife were members of a square dancing group, and within a couple of weeks, Alan was back at the square dancing group with various partners.
News anchor Joe Birch observed Roberts' lack of emotion during media coverage.
When somebody's wife disappears, you'd expect to see a level of emotion, and we just didn't see it from Alan Roberts. He was just kind of calm, cool, and collected, and very direct, and there wasn't a lot of teary-eyed, emotional appeals that we see a lot in kidnapping cases.
Investigators kept watching Roberts as he tried to carry on with his life, struggling with the frustration of not knowing where his wife was and being the only suspect in her disappearance. Yet they saw nothing that led them to Doe Roberts. In September, the man with the Asian accent resurfaced, now saying Alan was involved.
The kidnapper began calling people in the Eads community, stating that Doe Roberts was still alive. Many of the phone calls indicated Alan was part of the scheme to kidnap his wife. It was extremely frustrating because he never gave specific points to drop money.
Several of the people who talked to the kidnapper had caller IDs on their phones, so agents traced the calls to phone booths on a well-traveled road.
We would go to the phone booths immediately, and of course, the individual who was making the phone call was already gone. Other people had already used the phone. We would check the phones for possible fingerprints, and there was just never any evidence to tie an individual to that phone.
Okay. Here?
Each of the calls were made within a few miles of the Roberts house, a significant risk in a small community buzzing about the case. This boldness suggested that the caller was an insider, familiar enough to be inconspicuous in public, and that he considered himself beyond the reach of investigators. Desperate for something solid, Alan Roberts took things into his own hands, offering a reward for Doe's safe return, and announcing he disconnected the FBI's recording and tracing equipment from his phone so the kidnapper could call freely. On October 8th, 1992, 2 months after Doe disappeared, the kidnapper called Alan Roberts again.
Is she okay?
He told him to drive to a payphone at a country store a mile away. Now. Roberts hurried to the store. Once again, he was on his own, with no corroborating witness to prove what was happening. The phone was already ringing when he arrived. He hoped, finally, this would be his chance to get his wife back.
Hello?
2 months after someone abducted 65-year-old Doe Roberts, the kidnapper ordered her husband, Alan Roberts, to a payphone.
Hello? Hello?
The man with the Asian accent said Doe was alive and still with him.
That's my wife's birthday.
He asked Roberts for the name of an intermediary, someone Alan trusted that the kidnapper could contact.
Somebody at the church? What do you mean, somebody at the church?
Roberts suggested Charles Lord, a leading church member and friend of the family. The caller said he would be in touch about where to bring the ransom money.
Can I talk to Doe? Please, let me talk to Doe. What? Hello?
Then he hung up.
Well, they've been good neighbors.
Charles Lord, the man Roberts picked to be his intermediary, was a civil servant and treasurer of the local church. He made a public appeal to the kidnapper on Alan Roberts' behalf, asking the man to call him and finally give specific instructions for a ransom drop.
Call my number, and I'll line up how to get.
They all wanted to get Doe back.
There you go.
More calls from the kidnapper came to Charles Lord and others in the community, but still no details for an exchange. In November 1992, Charles Lord called investigators to his home. Special Agent Joanne Overall hoped they finally had a direct link to the kidnapper.
Charles Lord stated that late in the evening, he heard a car out on his cove. He walked down to the mailbox, and there was a letter placed in his mailbox, which was a kidnapping ransom letter.
Investigators were glad to have physical evidence. Fingerprints, hairs of fibers on the letter might provide a link to the kidnapper. But by the time they got to it, they found the evidence tainted.
Charles Lord took this letter and showed it to several people before we were called in and obtained the letter. So there was quite a few fingerprints on the letter before we got it.
Lab examiners checked all of the prints, determining they belonged to Lord and the people he let handle the letter. Nothing to lead them to the kidnapper. The message was no help either. The ransom had been lowered, but still, no instructions for a drop. It seemed the kidnapper was playing games with them. In case he contacted Lord again, agents set a trap.
Our office set up surveillance on his mailbox using a hidden camera. which was literally placed in a birdhouse close to the mailbox.
If the kidnapper dropped off another note, they'd have him on tape. Agents also installed wiretap and recording devices on Lord's telephone.
Basically what you do is have the phone and you just hit the play button.
They still had no real evidence against Alan Roberts. But a new suspect was developing.
Yes, sir. Come on in.
Charles Lord began taking an active role in the investigation, often stopping by the sheriff's office to check on their progress.
The Roberts, Doe Roberts? Yes, sir.
The deputies became suspicious.
Wanted to come by and
He seemed too interested. Their suspicion deepened because of the peculiar nature of the phone calls he claimed he got from the kidnapper.
Charles Lord stated he received several phone calls from the kidnapper. He did say that he talked with Doe Roberts, which was unusual because none of the other callers talked with Doe Roberts.
Appreciate it.
But agents never got tapes of the calls.
But every time he received a telephone call, it appeared that our equipment didn't work.
Over the next week, Lord reported another ransom letter and one of Doe's scarves placed in his mailbox. Agents recovered no evidence from the items, but hoped their camera captured images of the kidnapper. They had plenty of the regular mail carrier. But when the tape got to where the kidnapper should appear, it went blank.
When the equipment that was placed at Charles Lord's residence continued to fail, I just thought we had poor equipment. And eventually, it became apparent that somebody was tampering with it.
Agents suspected the interference came from Charles Lord. Then the victim's husband, Alan Roberts, reported a strange encounter with Lord. He said the night before, at the Eads Community Center, Lord summoned him to a private meeting. Alan was surprised when his friend offered to help get Doe back for a price.
Alan Roberts told me that Charles Lord had advised that he had underworld contacts and that there was information available if Charles could get some money to pay for it. Also, Alan advised at that time that Charles Lord was wearing a gun.
It was clear Lord was somehow involved. But investigators needed more than suspicion. They needed evidence. On March 4th, 1993, 7 months after Doe disappeared, there was another twist in the case. Memphis news anchor Joe Birch received a call at his office.
Yes. I've never recorded a telephone conversation before, but I decided that I would record this conversation. The call set off a trigger in my mind that this could be the same individual who's been making the anonymous calls in the Doe Roberts case, and I tried to get the man to stay on the line for as long as he would stay.
As Birch spoke to the man with the Asian accent, he tried to elicit details as to who the caller was and what happened to Doe. When Birch tried to set up a ransom drop, the caller hung up.
Hello? Hello? I took the tape directly into my boss's office. We immediately called the FBI and the Shelby County Sheriff's Department.
What can you tell us about Doe Roberts?
Investigators agreed to WMC-TV airing the tape, hoping it might flush the kidnapper out. It worked. The kidnapper called back. He was angry they aired the tape and demanded no more coverage. But this time, Joe Birch got him to do what no one else had. arrange a ransom drop. Agents and sheriff's inspectors staked out the drop location, ready to grab the caller who had eluded them for so long.
Is that her?
That's her.
You could be positive.
Yeah.
As instructed, a reporter from WMC-TV drove to the spot with $80,000 in cash.
It's her, but I don't see anybody else. Do you see anybody else?
Everyone waited, hoping.
Sit tight. Sit tight. We may have somebody else. They may be waiting. Contact.
But the kidnapper never showed.
She's leaving. Okay.
It didn't happen.
One more disappointment in a frustrating investigation.
1409, be advised, subject has just left. No contact. Show us going ahead and clearing the scene.
Other deputies observed Charles Lord was home the entire time. Weeks passed with no movement on the case. Then, in June 1993, the kidnapper arranged another drop. He called two of Doe's nephews and told them to bring the ransom money to a local motel. Soon, the elusive kidnapper finally would surface. In June 1993, investigators working the Doe Roberts kidnapping staked out an Eads, Tennessee motel. Special Agent Joanne Overall was part of the surveillance.
Doe Roberts' nephews received a call from the kidnapper, and they tried to make an arranged ransom drop. They were told to go to a motel room, which they did, but they also called the FBI. They were waiting to get a phone call or meet with somebody.
Other surveillance deputies had been unable to find suspect Charles Lord that night. As the team at the motel watched, a man approached. It was Lord. He went to the room the nephews had rented.
Charles Lord told the nephews of Doe Roberts that he had received a call from the kidnapper and that he was to show up there and get the money, and he would receive a phone call as to where to take the money.
But the nephews wouldn't give him the cash. They said they wanted to deal with the kidnapper directly. Investigators were sure that was exactly who they were dealing with.
He is the only individual who had received a telephone call stating that he had talked with Doe Roberts, and now he was meeting with somebody to pick up money, but we did not have enough evidence at that time to go forward with an arrest.
They did, however, increase their focus on Lord. To look for a financial motive to the kidnapping, the FBI subpoenaed Lord's bank records.
We went through records trying to determine if he had loans out, what his financial holdings were, and it became apparent that Charles Lord owed a lot of money to several banks in town, substantial amounts of money, and that he was unable to meet the payments and that he had filed for bankruptcy.
That circumstantial evidence allowed investigators to secure a search warrant for Lord's house. In late June 1993, they served the warrant, which allowed them to look for and seize any financial documents. Some of the files they recovered revealed Lord's criminal past.
He had embezzled over $150,000 from the Memphis depot, where he had retired several years prior, and he had embezzled approximately $70,000 from the church there in Eads, where he was attending.
As treasurer of the church, Lord had access to the parish bank accounts and cash donations. Despite the find, investigators still had no direct evidence of the abduction.
We had nothing that we could use to charge him with the kidnapping and the murder of Doe Roberts. It was important to obtain a confession from Charles Lord because we had no body.
Good, maybe this will help us out a little bit.
One agent working the case was trained in criminal profiling.
He wants more attention.
Analyzing Lord's actions, he offered a behavioral profile to help get the confession.
We have here, we got all these files. Is he gonna repeat his...
He suggested Lord was a manipulative, pathological liar who believed he was untouchable.
It's gonna help us out, but I don't know if it's gonna...
The agent felt that overwhelming the suspect's ego was the only way to beat him.
What you guys need to do is let
The
him...
plan was to bring Lord in for an interview and let him see what he would take to be evidence of a massive investigation against him for months.
push into his confessing.
Agents created numerous evidence boxes, hoping to trump Lord's belief he was above the investigation. Then, on August 25, 1993, at the FBI's Memphis field office, investigators met with Lord and his attorney.
I got some questions about, do you know anything about Mrs. Doe Roberts?
As Charles Lord sat in that room during the interview, I was watching him look at these boxes, realizing that he had been under surveillance for a lot longer than he had anticipated, and he became very nervous.
The FBI's tactics appeared to be working. Lord eventually admitted to making some of the ransom calls. He said he did it to keep the investigation alive for Doe's sake, but denied any involvement in her abduction. Sensing that he was ready to crack, the investigators offered him a deal.
Charles Lord was told by our office, as well as the Shelby County inspector, that if he would take a polygraph and pass a polygraph, we would not look at him any further for the Doe Roberts kidnapping. However, if he failed the polygraph, his attorney and Charles Lord agreed to a further interrogation in reference to the kidnapping.
He agreed. After asking control questions to gauge Lord's truthful response levels, the polygraph examiner asked about Doe, including whether Lord was involved in her abduction.
Did you harm Doe Roberts?
In the end, the examiner believed the polygraph results showed Lord being deceptive. Though the results could not be used in court, they meant authorities could continue questioning the suspect. With Lord's attorney present in the interrogation room, FBI agents and inspectors from the Shelby County Sheriff's Department pressed the suspect, returning again and again to the polygraph results.
I've got every piece of evidence I need, what I need you to do.
At first, he continued to deny involvement, but after several hours, the interview tactics wore him down. Lord said he was ready to tell them what happened. He said he needed cash to pay back his loans and cover the money he stole from the church, and decided to kidnap Doe for ransom. On August 6, 1992, he called the Roberts, posing as a property buyer named Sam Wagner, and arranged to meet Alan. The next day, when he knew Alan was waiting at the development property, he drove by their house. Doe was bringing in the mail.
Doe, there's been an accident.
He knew she would trust him.
Alan's been involved in an accident. Yeah, get in the car and I'll take you to him.
What happened? Do you know? Is he all right?
Lord told investigators he planned to release Doe after he got the ransom, but she suffered a fatal heart attack in his car. He said he panicked and dumped her body and her purse, but he would not say where.
Would you be willing to take us to where she is?
The investigators believed he was lying, at least about planning to release Doe, and perhaps about other details.
You did what you were supposed to do.
Special Agent Joanne Overall knew they had to find the body to check his story. They offered a deal.
Charles Lord agreed to tell us where Doe Roberts' body was after he had confessed to the kidnapping in exchange for Shelby County not pursuing the death penalty.
Lord claimed he dumped her in the Wolf River, a slow-moving river that runs 90 miles across the southwest corner of the state. The Wolf River empties into the Mississippi at Memphis. Lord said he dumped the remains from a bridge in Fayette County, 13 miles from the Roberts' home. Divers would begin 50 yards upriver, searching for the body and purse. Lieutenant John Yancey of the Shelby County Sheriff's Department led the dive in the murky river.
We had 21 divers involved total. The visibility in the river was zero. It was total black water.
And in the dark water, several species of venomous snakes. Adding to the challenge was the fact that the crime took place a year earlier. Any remains would be scattered and difficult to find. FBI agents and sheriff's deputies helped the divers by stretching a rope across the river's width. Divers held onto the rope and moved across its length, searching the river bottom by hand.
Normally you do an arm span, arm over arm for a search for a body because it's large. But we were looking for contents of the purse at the time to try to make sure that this was actually the scene. So we had to bring it down to where we were, instead of doing the large arm spans, we were having to do what I call this the hand grab. And that's where you just get the dirt with your hand, and that way you're able to find everything on the bottom.
Once the divers reached the other bank, the team would move the rope a foot downriver and start over. Anytime a diver found something, he signaled, and additional divers came in to mark and extract the item.
We found a safe that had been taken in a robbery of a cleaner's, and the money had fallen out of the safe, and we found the pennies on the bottom and the dollar bills, but we found no contents of any of her purse. So I feel like if we'd have found pennies on the bottom, we would have found her makeup or a wallet or IDs or anything times back to her.
In 110-degree heat, the team continued their search of every square inch.
On my second day, I was on the bridge, and an elderly lady walked up to me and said, "I want you to do me a favor." And I said, "I'll try to if I can." She said, "I want you to find us something today so we can get this over with, so we can go ahead and bury Doe and get this case over with."
After 3 full days, they had searched a half-mile of the river. They believed the body would not have gone farther than that in the lowland waters.
I went to my boss, my chief, and I told him, I said, based on my experience and what we have done, she's not in here. But if you want us to continue the search, we'll search till it runs into Mississippi, ever how you want to do it. But I can tell you right now, she's not here.
Investigators were convinced Lord had lied to them, unnecessarily placing the dive team in danger. Special Agent Overall confronted Lord.
We took Charles Lord out to the site and explained to him that these divers were putting their lives in jeopardy and we needed to find the body, and it didn't appear that the body was there.
The suspect had run out of lies. Now he was ready to tell investigators what really happened to Doe Roberts. After a 3-day search of Tennessee's Wolf River, dive leader Lieutenant John Yancey believed the remains of kidnapping victim Doe Roberts were not in the river.
We had searched everywhere possible, and just over the years of experience, I would have found something by now, either some bones, some makeup, or something. I said, based on my experience, she's not in here. There the divers are, she's not there.
Investigators confronted suspect Charles Lord.
The deal's going to come off the table.
Realizing they would not give up until they got the truth, Lord admitted Doe had not died of a heart attack in his car.
They
He said he took her to his house and tied her up in a room above the garage. He could never let his neighbor go, now. He tried to kill her with sleeping pills. When that didn't work, he smothered her with a pillow. Lord said he buried her in his backyard compost heap. On top of the body, he placed a layer of lime, then concrete, hoping they would hasten decomposition. They needed to determine if Lord was telling the truth this time, to retrieve evidence and give Doe's family the closure of knowing what happened.
Stand by.
The sheriff's department called in forensic anthropologists from the University of Tennessee. After removing layers of leaves and compost, they began the dig. Shelby County Sheriff's Lieutenant Ronald Goodwin supervised the meticulous excavation.
It's just using brushes and little trowels, much like uncovering artifacts. And it's one spoonful at a time to make sure that you don't miss any evidence and make sure you don't do anything to harm what evidence may be with the body.
After 2 hours, they pierced a shell of concrete and lime. In the space underneath, a body.
Well, the first thing that we came to was the hand. The rest of the body was laying flat in the grave site on its back, face up.
It took 17 hours to completely exhume the remains, and what investigators found surprised them.
The skin was intact. The body was in such good condition, I felt like that many scientific tests that we could run might reveal. It's poisoning, cause of death, sexual attack, or whatever. It appeared that the actions that Mr. Lord had taken, such as the lime and so forth on top of the body, had worked in reverse, and it had preserved the body for us.
The most chilling detail was the position of the 65-year-old woman's hand.
The only thing that was out of normal position was the hand, which was up in front of her face in a defensive position with the fingers spread.
It appeared to investigators she might not have been dead when she was buried.
Maybe she was still alive. Maybe she was pushing up with her hand.
Over a year after Doe Roberts disappeared, the FBI and Alan Roberts had their evidence. On October 19, 1993, Charles Lord pled guilty to first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to life plus 25 years. Doe's husband, Alan, had endured being a suspect for months. Now, with the truth out, he could finally lay Doe to rest. But one challenge remains for Alan Roberts.
It's an uneven closure. I'm trying to forget about Charles Lord, and I'm praying that God will let me forgive him. I'm praying that Doe is in God's hands right now.
Mr. and Mrs. Roberts enjoyed 43 years of marriage before they were torn apart. He has faith that one day he will see her again. A young man vanishes without a trace. Concern turns to terror when the ransom calls begin. Police and the FBI battle a brutal drug cartel, uncovering a deadly crime ring that will do anything to get what they want.
Chicago street gang thought they had figured out how to kidnap people for ransom again and again and never get caught. But their one mistake was they underestimated the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. Agents teamed up with one of the victim's brave relatives to break the ruthless gang who destroyed lives for profit.
June 27th, 1996, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 90 miles north of Chicago on the western shore of Lake Michigan. "17-year-old high school senior Jaime Estrada and his cousin Roberto Alvarez pulled up outside a convenience store on the city's south side. Jaime went in for sodas, leaving Roberto in the custom Monte Carlo Jaime and his brothers owned.
Damn right, man. So what's going on tonight?
The store was a popular hangout where they often met friends.
Rough.
When Jaime came out, he spotted a girl he recognized. Jaime had been wanting to get to know the girl more and went to talk with her. A star catcher in local baseball leagues, Jaime was a popular kid. As Roberto was talking with a friend, he noticed the van pull away. He figured Jaime had left with the girl and would probably be right back. When Jaime had not returned after more than an hour, Roberto began to worry. Something was wrong. So Roberto decided to see if Jaime had gone home. He told Jaime's brother Paulo what had happened and found he had not come home.
What's going on? ¿Qué pasa?
That's that Jaime's been missing for now.
No one had heard from him since he left.
We're supposed to get a couple of sodas.
It was not like Jaime to run off, leaving his cousin and his car. His parents tried to figure out what to do.
And then I've been waiting there for an hour. He still hasn't come back.
Let's go look for your brother right now.
They decided to split up and look for him in separate cars.
Go to the other hangout in Chicago. No.
His mother stayed home in case Jaime called. The family searched the area for hours. Then, Jaime's oldest brother, Mark, received a page. The area code was 312 Chicago. After the phone number was 187, Jaime's personal code. Then, 911. It was an emergency. Mark stopped at the first phone booth he saw. He hoped Jaime was all right. A man answered, a voice he did not recognize. He said they had kidnapped Jaime and wanted $70,000 for his return. The man said they were serious and warned that if the family did not follow instructions, they would cut off Jaime's ears, skin him, and send body parts in the mail. And if anyone went to the police, they would kill Jaime and the entire Estrada family. Mark was in disbelief. He He called the number again. Maybe it was a prank. No one answered.
I didn't hear from anybody.
Jaime's father returned home. His wife said no one called. They were all getting frantic. When Mark came back, he told them about the call, the kidnapping, the threats. Mr. Estrada wanted to call the police immediately, but Mark told them the kidnappers would torture Jaime. They'd kill him.
We should do this.
We can't go to the
Gotta
police.
call
They
police.
said if we go to the police, that they're gonna cut off his ears, they're gonna skin him, and they're gonna mail it to us.
The family did not know what to do.
Okay. Take him back to the kitchen.
They struggled with the decision all night, waiting for another phone call. But none came.
Without waiting anymore.
By dawn, Mr. Estrada could wait no longer. He needed to help his
We
son.
need to do something. We got to call the police.
It had been more than 9 hours since Jaime was last seen. Mr. Estrada decided that he and Mark would go to the police. They had to take the chance. At the Milwaukee Police 2nd District Station,
Oh, yeah, the area code.
Mark and his father explained what happened to a detective on the Violent Crime Squad.
I called them and they said that if we went to the police, that they would cut off his ears.
Since this was an armed abduction that crossed state lines from Wisconsin to Illinois, the police called in the FBI.
Get the duty agent.
All right, thanks. Okay,
At the Milwaukee field office, FBI Special Agent Dan Kraft had just arrived at work.
I was sitting at my desk and I received a call. An 18-year-old kid had been kidnapped.
Kraft had to act quickly.
I met with the victim's father and his older brother and tried to take a detailed interview of them based on what had happened, when it had happened, potentially why. I realized that this was going to become a major case.
Back at the Estrada house,
Why, who is this?
Jaime's brother Paulo answered the phone.
Who is this?
Brother.
It was the kidnappers. The man on the phone changed the ransom to $30,000 and also wanted the Monte Carlo.
What are you talking about?
He said they could prove their threats were serious. They had shot Jaime. Jaime confirmed he was shot.
Jaime!
He was hurt, bad. He pleaded with his brother to hurry.
Yeah?
Jaime!
Still, the man gave no details for a ransom drop. The man said they'd call again on Paulo's cell phone.
Hello? Hello? They shot Jaime. They
shot him?
They want $30,000.
Paulo told the others the terrifying news.
Come on in, have a seat over here.
Paulo met his father and brother Mark at the FBI office.
What we're trying to do is take control of this situation.
Agents immediately tapped Paulo's cell phone since the kidnappers said they would be calling it next.
make sure you push this down. And I have to start the recording before you answer the phone.
They also attached a recording device and tracing system to the Estrada's home
First
telephone.
thing you need to know is that this is the only phone it's going to work with.
As the FBI continued to set up, they kept interviewing the family, not wasting a second in gathering information.
One of the first things that we did was set up what we call a rapid start. It's a computer database that helps us to manage a major case. We utilized rapid start to put in all the information that we had received at this point. Every little data point that we would come up with, even if it was partial.
The sophisticated database helps track leads and find links in complex, quickly moving cases.
I'll drop off warrants for the United States. Okay. There's your phone. Don't answer again.
That afternoon, Paulo's phone rang.
Real quick, quick.
He knew to try to get as much information as possible.
Keep him on the phone as long as you can. Go ahead.
Hello.
The caller asked if Paulo had the ransom.
The money.
Paulo said he had about half.
Well,
He
yeah.
needed more
No,
time.
the drop is gonna go perfect as scheduled. Jaime?
Jaime came on the phone and
Jaime.
told his brother to hurry. He was bleeding.
Tell your brother stop dragging it out. Tell your brother stop changing plans on us, eh?
Don't worry, we're coming to get you. We're doing everything we can. You're gonna be okay, all right?
You better have it, bro.
Hello? They hung up.
Should help.
While agents and detectives tried to trace the number, the Estradas moved to an adjacent room to wait for more calls. In a kidnapping case, the FBI tries to move deliberately, but not hastily.
And we have a tendency to try to slow things down and work at our pace and try to control. When a victim is shot, now you're dealing with a life and death matter, and every minute, every moment becomes critical.
3 hours later, Paulo got another call. Special Agent Kraft was concerned about how Paulo would handle it.
These type of situations are extremely stressful to begin with. When you factor in a person who's a relative who loves the victim, cares about the victim, they're going to act on emotions every time, and they can make bad judgments.
But despite the threats to his wounded brother, Paulo remained calm. The kidnappers insisted Paulo make the ransom drop of the car and cash at a fast food restaurant in Chicago. They said they'd call back with more details.
They hung up.
You never want to introduce a civilian into a high-risk situation.
But agents had no choice. Paulo would have to drop the car off himself. But since he would need a ride back home, an undercover agent could pose as a friend to provide at least some protection from Paulo.
Escorting you out to the site.
The team left for Chicago. Milwaukee agents called in their counterparts at the Chicago FBI field office. Special Agent Kevin Cassidy would take the lead in that city.
Immediately after that notification from Milwaukee, when we knew the agents were coming, we started to organize our squad. And we knew that this was going to be a fast-moving case where we needed to be able to quickly mobilize our resources.
The drive from Milwaukee would take an hour and a half. That gave Chicago agents time to prepare. Violent Crime Squad Supervisory Special Agent Ron Hosko set up a command post at a local sports arena.
We gathered a number of folks up on the west side of the city by the United Center in a parking lot and briefed everybody on what we understood was the situation with the kidnapping demands.
Everybody's going to be on.
The United Center is centrally located, which gave agents greater flexibility for quickly getting almost anywhere in the city.
The perimeters, let us know spots that we can set up our team, all right?
As Paulo and Special Agent Kraft traveled to the meeting place, Kraft used the time to prepare Paulo for how to handle the next call from the kidnappers.
I would coach him and practice with him. I would act as a kidnapper and fire things at him, and I could see how he would react, and I could, make suggestions to him. Well, you don't want to do that, or you want to stay away from certain areas, or draw them out more by asking specific questions.
Paulo and Kraft finally arrived at the staging area. Surveillance agents had already checked the fast food restaurant, the site of the ransom drop. The place was far from a controlled environment.
And our concerns were that there was a lot of traffic, foot traffic, pedestrian traffic, not only into the fast food shop, but in the area. And With the threats that we'd already received, we had concerns about our ability to prevent any kind of violent act with respect to the public who might be in that area at the wrong time.
But Paulo and the agents were ready. They had the money and the car.
Yeah. And one other thing, don't get out of your vehicle till the SUV is in position. All right?
Paulo got another call. Agents had him try to change the drop site to one that would be safer for everyone. But it was important he did not appear adamant.
The longer we, in effect, negotiate through the victim's brother, the more suspicious the subjects become that there's some law enforcement involvement. Ultimately, the discussions between the victim's brother and the kidnappers resulted in their agreeing to have this exchange at a department store parking lot that was a few miles away from the original location.
The kidnappers ordered Paulo to leave the money in the Monte Carlo with the doors unlocked and the keys in the ignition. Once they had the ransom and were safely away, they would allow Jaime to call Paulo to tell him where he was. Agents left right away to set up at the parking lot. It was an ideal location for protecting the public, but not Paulo. Agents would need to be hidden at a distance around the perimeter. It was Paulo who would have to face the kidnappers up close. But getting his little brother back was worth the risk. In 1996, Chicago agents and detectives were trying to rescue kidnapping victim Jaime Estrada. But the kidnappers would not bring their victim to the site of the ransom drop, according to FBI Special Agent Dan Kraft.
What we generally will try to do is have an exchange, an even exchange, the victim and the money for an even exchange. In this particular case, the kidnappers would not do that. It was not negotiable. It was not something I was very comfortable with, but sometimes you have to bend a little bit to get your ultimate goal.
The kidnappers ordered Jaime's brother Paulo to leave $30,000 in the Estrada brothers' custom Monte Carlo in a deserted parking lot. But the area was not entirely deserted. Surveillance units were hidden nearby, watching. Nearly 27 hours had passed since Jaime was abducted. Almost a full day since he was shot. Since Jaime needed medical attention, agents could not afford the time it might take to follow subjects or risk losing them. So they decided to arrest the kidnappers when the ransom drop was made. Unfortunately, the size of the location chosen by the kidnappers would make the arrest difficult to pull off. FBI Special Agent Ron Hosko.
This was a big, fairly expansive parking lot that was empty. Our vehicles were, from a starting point, on the outside of that lot, trying to maintain discreet surveillance. So they had a fair amount of open ground that they had to cross to get in there.
Agents planned to counter this problem by attempting to keep the kidnappers off balance.
And they wanted the car left with the keys in the ignition and the doors unlocked. Well, we were going to screw that up a little bit by having the victim's brother lock the doors to the car, because it would end up stunning the kidnappers ever so slightly to where now they will have to regroup, reevaluate the situation, come up with a different plan.
We have 2 subjects in the target vehicle.
After a few minutes, a gray sedan pulled in. It looked like there were 3 men inside.
One of them got out, went over to the car, looked in, could see that the money was sitting on the front seat, so you could almost see him with joy and this desire. And then he goes to open up the door, and he can't get the door open, and the keys to the car are in the vehicle.
because he didn't know what to do. So they go from being in control to now they have to react. We wanted to throw them off their game, and it swings the control back over to us.
All units, go, go, go!
The takedown signal was given. All units began to converge. But the suspects reacted instantly.
They immediately accelerated away from us before the other surveillance units had an opportunity to close the net on them.
Someone in the car pointed a gun at an agent, then threw something out of the window.
They were weaving around the responding vehicles, who are properly hesitant to ram that vehicle for any number of good reasons, not the least of which is that the victim could have been in the trunk.
The suspects got on an expressway and tore off toward downtown. Despite the late hour, there was still civilian traffic in danger.
We reached speeds of 120 miles an hour, and the kidnappers were in this stolen vehicle, and they were trying to cause an accident by going from one shoulder across 4 or 5 lanes of traffic all the way over to another shoulder, cutting cars off.
All right, Cherokee, come on up the wrong side of them. We're going to take them down.
Agents used their training to end the pursuit.
And they were able to execute what we call the pit maneuver, whereby they actually bumped the rear quarter panel. And the vehicle did not lose control completely. It just swerved slightly, but it was enough for the driver to slow down to a much lower speed, and our vehicles basically boxed them in at that point, and they came to a complete stop.
On the highway, agents and detectives surrounded the car. They knew the men inside were armed and dangerous.
We still had great concern about weapons, and while we could have a perimeter, you cannot prevent subjects from doing something you may not expect, like engaging in gunfire.
We removed all of the occupants of the car. We ended up finding 3 subjects in the car.
They all claimed to know nothing about Jaime Estrada and wouldn't even give agents their names. Each had ammunition, but no guns.
Keep them still.
Once they had the 3 men safely in custody, investigators checked to see if anything or anyone was in the trunk. It was empty. Jaime was not with them.
And it was certainly our suspicion that at least one co-conspirator was with Jaime Estrada, that was still holding him. And we needed to identify who that person was and where they were, and do that quickly.
Agents ran the license plate number and searched the rest of the car, and discovered a knife and a night vision rifle scope. They also found several pagers, a cell phone, and a piece of cardboard with Paulo's cell phone number written on it. On the roadside near the start of the pursuit, agents located a loaded 9mm semi-automatic handgun, likely the object seen thrown from the suspect's car. At the Chicago field office, agents tried to interview each of the suspects individually.
There's a gang after us, man. I see no.
They refused to cooperate.
When's the last time you saw a gang with lights and sirens?
We stopped eventually.
During the interviews, the suspect's pagers went off multiple times. Someone was desperately trying to get in touch with him.
Take a look at that number. You know whose number this is.
The men swore they did not recognize the numbers.
Oh, yeah, sure it is. What are you trying to hide? Look at these numbers.
The investigators were sure it was the rest of the group trying to find out what happened. So they tried tracing that number.
But it was an unpublished number, and the phone company would not give us the address. We pleaded with the phone company and promised them that we would give them a subpoena, but it's logistically impossible on a Friday night at 11 o'clock to try to get a judge to sign a court order.
What do I have to do to give you these numbers?
It had been a full day since the teenager was shot. Agents were frustrated that while Jaime was probably dying, a subpoena stood in their way.
I tried to plead, man to man, father to father. I said, what if it was your child? Wouldn't you want law enforcement to do everything humanly possible? And he just basically said, I don't care. We absolutely swore to him that, trust us, we're the FBI, we will get you the subpoena.
The FBI? Could I please speak to a supervisor?
And they said, without a subpoena, we're not going to give you the information.
The night ended with no lead on where Jaime was. The next afternoon, on the city's west side, someone dumped a body. While Chicago investigators struggled to find kidnapping victim Jaime Estrada, passers-by discovered a badly wounded man lying in the street on the city's west side.
Chicago emergency, Okendo.
A Chicago 911 operator took the emergency call and immediately dispatched patrol units and an ambulance.
Okay, does anybody...
Paramedics advised Illinois Masonic Hospital they were bringing in a man with a gunshot wound. He identified himself as Jaime Estrada. A Cook County Sheriff's investigator arrived at the hospital. The 17-year-old was not only alive, he was still conscious.
Yes.
The investigator asked the doctor in charge if he could talk with Jaime.
Cook County Sheriff's Office, and wondering if I could have...
He said Jaime needed immediate surgery, but since the OR was still being prepared, there was time for a quick interview if Jaime agreed.
Okay, just a couple minutes.
He said he could do it.
Okay.
Can you tell me a little bit about what happened?
Went in a convenience store to get some drinks.
He said 2 nights before, he'd gone to talk to a girl he liked. He didn't know her well. While they were talking, the driver pulled a gun. It happened so quickly. He said it felt like they drove for about 2 hours. Several armed men beat him. He could not ID them. FBI Special Agent Kevin Cassidy.
Jaime could not provide any real detail regarding the identifying features of his kidnappers due to the fact he was blindfolded.
Jaime remembered passing 3 toll booths. He told the investigator that about 15 minutes after the 3rd toll booth, the van stopped. The men hustled him into a house or an apartment, he wasn't sure which.
It's your brother, man!
There they roughed him up some more, yelling about the money he owed them for the drugs.
I'll kill you, bro. I'll kill you! Huh?
He tried to tell them they had the wrong guy. That was the wrong thing to say.
You know what I'm saying, man? I'll kill you, bro. I'll kill you! Just give me the number. What's the number, S.A.?
Ron,
Yo, get this guy. Beat him
They
senseless.
demanded the phone numbers to all of his family members.
What?
I got the number. 414-555-7577.
Get this guy Bruin out of here.
The men carefully avoided speaking their own names, but there were others who did.
During the time he was held there, he heard female voices, and he also heard one of those voices referred to a subject as Beto.
Jaime believed it was Beto that guarded him most of the time. Sometime the next morning, Jaime was just getting to sleep. Suddenly,
Beto, ¿qué pasó?
it took him a minute to realize he'd been shot.
Miguel, get them, cállate, cállate.
It even surprised some of the kidnappers. They promptly moved Jaime to a bathroom.
You'll be okay. Cállate, you'll be okay, man.
Golly!
Hey, man, you'll be okay.
Go.
Hey, man. Hey, look, you're gonna be okay, all right? Here.
Yo,
Put this on here. Hold this right here, okay? You're gonna be okay, man.
Bro, vente, get the car, bro. Beto,
All right.
come on, man, get out of here. God, Dios mío, man. He's not gonna be fine. You're gonna be all right, man.
He fell in and out of consciousness, so his memory was fuzzy. He remembered a white tile floor, a red toilet seat, maybe a red shower curtain. That was all. Jaime's gunshot wound had gone untreated for 2 days and was badly infected. He needed so many surgeries that doctors had to put him into a drug-induced coma so he could survive the ordeal. Doctors were surprised at the young man's strength, that he had survived this long. But their prognosis was not good. Several suspects were still at large. Meanwhile, on Newland Avenue in northern Chicago, a resident heard a commotion and saw what looked like 2 armed men forcing 2 others toward a van. The captives broke loose and ran. The Jaime Estrada kidnapping case was about to become much more complicated. The same day, kidnapping victim Jaime Estrada was found. A man in northern Chicago saw what appeared to be a double kidnapping outside his house on Newland Avenue. The victims managed to escape. The resident contacted Chicago police, and emergency operators sent patrol officers to the scene.
32-25. Okay. Right off of Belmont. All right, stay inside the house. Just letting you know the police are being dispatched as we speak.
I was walking home, and
Dispatch asked the officers to transport the 2 victims to Chicago PD's Area 5
guys
to be interviewed by FBI Special Agent Kevin Cassidy.
Next thing you know, this van pulled in front of me.
One of them, Pedro Montoya, explained how he'd been abducted. A week earlier, he was outside his house when a van pulled up. Several men jumped out with guns and forced him inside. The other man, Chavo Rodriguez, had the same story.
They were basically grabbed off the street and forcibly put into a blue and white van.
Special Agent Cassidy remembered that Jaime was also kidnapped in a blue and white van. He decided to show Montoya and Rodriguez mugshots of the men arrested in connection with Estrada's abduction.
Both victims immediately responded that those were the same individuals that had kidnapped them.
And there were two others, the armed men they escaped from.
We then started to interview them in greater detail.
They said they were held in the basement of a house with a third man.
All right, just spin them around and put them on the post here.
They were all bound to metal poles. Each of their families were called with demands for ransom money and cars. For more than a week, the kidnappers barely fed the men. A diabetic, Rodriguez was affected most. Without his medication, his blood sugar rose, which could have rendered him unconscious or even killed him. Investigators suspected that Jaime was not the third man. He said he had been held in a bathroom, not a basement. So they showed the men his photo. Investigators were right. It wasn't him.
Did he escape with you at the same time?
They said the day before, the third man managed to escape by breaking through the duct tape that held him.
He freed himself.
They never saw him again and did not know who he was. When the kidnappers realized the third man had escaped, they tried moving Rodriguez and Montoya out of the house.
Come here, come here. Get out of here.
It was then that the men escaped. When asked why they may have been singled out to be kidnapped and held for ransom,
Albeit holding back something.
neither man had an answer.
But consider yourselves lucky that you made it out.
Agents obtained a federal search warrant for the Newland Avenue house where Rodriguez and Montoya were held. They collected duct tape bindings, hairs, clothing fibers, and dozens of fingerprints. The bathroom in the house did not match the description given by Jaime Estrada. Investigators believed he'd been held at a different location. Agents also recovered a Norenko assault rifle from the house.
A firearms expert determined that the bullet that was recovered from Jaime was consistent with one that would have been shot through the Norenko rifle.
In one of the bedrooms, agents found an envelope with a Los Angeles address. Inside were several photographs of a man holding the same Norenko rifle.
We took those photographs and put them into an appropriate photo array. We showed that photo array to several of the victims of the kidnappings, and they identified that as the subject that was involved in their kidnapping.
Now agents had the face of one of the two fugitives, but still no names. Agents then received information from running the kidnappers' license plates.
Our investigation led us to find an address in Chicago that was associated with the vehicle. We then had agents go to that residence.
FBI agents, man?
Agents spoke to Adalia Francisco. She reluctantly agreed to be interviewed. After persistent questioning, Mrs. Francisco told agents that her husband, Ricardo, was in hiding, having escaped from a band of kidnappers.
I don't know what to do.
Someone that kidnapped your husband?
Yes, they called here and...
Investigators determined he was the third man held in the Newland Avenue home.
And they just won't stop. I don't know what to do. And I've never...
Pressed further, she explained why her husband and the other men were being held.
And the last one was the sedan that you're asking.
Further investigation and intensive interviews led us to determine that there was a nexus to illegal drug activity in each one of these individual kidnappings.
Friends of Ricardo Francisco revealed that he was a drug runner. He owed a drug cartel $100,000. Montoya owed $130,000 to the same drug cartel. Rodriguez was not involved in dealing drugs himself. It was his son, but that did not matter to the cartel.
His son had owed some money, and they grabbed the dad. In the case of Jaime Estrada, our investigation did not reveal any involvement in illegal drug activity, and we do not believe he had any.
It seemed the cartel had been duped by the girl who lured Jaime into the van. Informants identified her as Juanita Gonzalez.
The true subject in this case was the girl. She was the one that had ripped off these guys from a kilo of cocaine. And then she tried to save her own hide by laying it off on an innocent person. She just blamed it on Jaime, who was just innocent in all of this.
All Jaime's family could do was pray he'd make it through surgery. But 17-year-old Jaime Estrada could not hold on. Infection eventually killed him. This has now become a case of murder. After conducting extensive interviews in the Newland Avenue neighborhood, agents finally identified the 3 men already in custody as Salome Varela, Jesus Ruiz, and Miguel Torres. The man in the photograph was identified as Jose de la Paz Sanchez. The final suspect was known only as Beto. They were still at large, wanted not only for kidnapping, but for murder. In 1996, Chicago area investigators captured 3 alleged members of a kidnapping ring that took the life of 17-year-old Jaime Estrada. They still had 3 suspects to find. FBI Special Agent Kevin Cassidy had the name of one of the fugitives, Jose Sanchez. His photo was discovered in an envelope during a crime scene search.
The envelope had an address in Los Angeles. We then surmised that the subject had fled the area, and it would be logical to look for him in Los Angeles. We obtained an arrest warrant, and we forwarded that information to our Los Angeles office.
In LA, FBI Special Agent Scott Hanley set out to apprehend Sanchez.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thanks. Well, good luck to you. Bye.
We went out to the location, which was a house in the Echo Park area of Los Angeles. After we'd been on the house for over 3 hours, one of the team observed a male Hispanic individual walk out of the house. But at that time, because of the distance away from him, we couldn't tell if it was Mr. Sanchez or not. We were able to follow him for approximately about a half hour on 3 different freeways in Los Angeles till he finally went to the West Los Angeles area.
The man parked outside a home improvement store. Even with a photograph of the suspect, they still could not tell if it was Sanchez.
If you've never met the person before and all you have is a photograph, you're trying to look at a real person to match it up with a photograph, and who knows how old that can be.
From the photo, they knew Sanchez had a Grim Reaper tattoo on his right upper arm.
One of the officers went in on foot to try to get a closer look of the individual. He followed this person in the store. I saw this tattoo of the Grim Reaper.
It was a positive ID. Agents were getting closer to nabbing the 4th suspect in Jaime Estrada's kidnapping and murder. In the end, it was surprisingly simple. Sanchez had been handcuffed before he realized what was happening. He was unarmed and arrested without incident. Sanchez confessed to taking part in Jaime Estrada's kidnapping and was present after Jaime had been shot.
When Mr. Sanchez admitted that he knew that Mr. Estrada had been shot, I asked him, well, you know, what was the condition of the boy? And he said, well, you know, he was talking to us, and I said, well, what did he ask? And he said, well, he asked, can I take him to the hospital? And I said, well, why didn't you do that? And he said, well, I didn't know what to do.
He also admitted to the other kidnappings and said they had been ordered by a drug cartel as a way to collect money owed to them.
Request that your lawyer be present before you answer any further questions.
Chicago investigators then began to intensify their search for the man known only as Beto. They conducted dozens of interviews with associates of the three men already in custody. They revealed that Beto had a sister, Monique Jimenez. Facing accessory charges, she cooperated.
Do you know anybody named Beto?
She said Beto's real name was Luis Carreno.
Have you been back?
The sister was able to describe some of the circumstances of Jaime's kidnapping, particularly the shooting. She advised that she was in the apartment at the time and had heard the shot and saw Jaime shot. And she advised that the person that shot him was in fact her brother.
There was blood there, so I had to go back.
She said she had cleaned blood off the bathroom floor with bleach. She gave the FBI the address of the apartment.
Yes, it's 2532 Moody Avenue.
An evidence response team processed the apartment, collecting samples, including the grout between the bathroom floor tiles. Lab examiners later discovered traces of blood in the grout. DNA testing proved the blood was Jaime's. In October 1997, federal prosecutors in Chicago tied the complex case together for a jury. The four suspects in custody, Salome Varela, Jesus Ruiz, Miguel Torres, and Jose Sanchez, were found guilty of racketeering, conspiracy, weapons violations, assault charges, and all four kidnappings. They were all sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The FBI tracked Juanita Gonzalez, the girl responsible for Jaime's abduction, to Mexico, where she completely disappeared. They are still looking for fugitive Luis Carreno, the man known as Beto.
He is currently wanted, and there's an outstanding arrest warrant for him. And we are working with Interpol and our other friends in foreign countries to attempt to locate him to this day, and we will continue to do so.
The Estradas pray that someday soon, the authorities will find Carreno, the man the FBI suspects killed Jaime. For the family and for the investigators who worked so hard to save Jaime, the case will never be over until everyone responsible for his death is brought to justice. In Miami, a young man is abducted at gunpoint. The kidnappers demand a fortune and threaten to kill. The police and FBI uncover disturbing leads and look for answers in the smallest clues in a desperate race to find the victim and bring him home to his family.
Kidnapping can shatter a family, bringing terror and heartache without warning. In 1984, with the flash of a gun, an ordinary business transaction became a violent abduction. In seconds, the son of a wealthy Miami developer was gone. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. The kidnappers' motivations seemed to be money, but agents would learn this case and its resolution were more complicated than anyone believed.
Miami, Florida, Tuesday, August 7th, 1984. At 6 o'clock, the sales office of real estate developer Jesus Portela was closing. Mr. Portela had emigrated from Cuba 22 years earlier, building a successful business in Miami. His 22-year-old son, Mario, was recently married and worked as a salesman for his father, as did Mario's uncle. A little after 6, a couple approached the office. Mario and his uncle went out to talk with him. The couple asked about condo prices. The man seemed anxious as they spoke. The uncle explained that the office had closed. He asked them to return in the morning. At the couple's request, he went inside to get some brochures for them. He didn't see what was happening outside. An armed man had pulled up, and the three were abducting Mario. The uncle spotted temporary tags on the car, but only got the last 3 numbers. He told Jesus what he saw. Mario, forced into a blue and gray car, heading north on 122nd Avenue. Then he called the police. But Mario's father couldn't wait for the police to arrive. He went looking for his son. Soon he spotted a car matching the description of the kidnapper's vehicle. For years, he had carried a licensed gun for protection. Now, he was ready to use it. But it was the wrong car. Realizing he couldn't find the kidnappers himself, Jesus returned to wait for the authorities. The Metro-Dade police responded to the kidnapping call. For Detective Alvaro Romero, abductions were not unusual in 1984.
At that time, we were inundated with kidnappings. We had probably 1 kidnapping a month related to narcotics or drug-related kidnappings, where the victims would either be involved in drugs themselves or possibly family members were involved in drug dealings.
But detectives quickly realized Mario's abduction was different.
Questioning Mr. Portela and recognizing the fact that he was a prominent businessman in the community led us to believe that it was not narcotics related and strictly a financial gain for the people who kidnapped his son.
It meant anybody who knew of Mr. Portela's wealth could be a suspect. Hoping the kidnappers left some trace behind, crime scene technicians dusted the door for fingerprints. Mario's uncle believed they might have touched it as they peered inside. No usable prints were found. Less than an hour after the kidnapping, the phone rang.
Hello? See?
Speaking in Spanish, the caller asked for Mario. Mr. Portela didn't recognize the voice.
No. ¿Quién habla?
The caller then announced he was part of a terrorist group that was holding Mario for $3 million in ransom. Although no recording equipment was in place, a Spanish-speaking detective listening in identified the caller's accent as Colombian. The caller threatened to kill Mario if Jesus notified police or the FBI, and warned that the group was watching the Portela house and gave the address. The distraught father pleaded to speak with his son. The kidnapper announced he would call Jesus's home in 3 days. Police could not trace the call, but it helped them understand the type of criminal they were facing.
We felt the kidnappers were very violent. They took precautions as far as the phone calls that they were making, and they were very serious in their threats. They knew what they were doing, and we took them very seriously.
As with any kidnap for ransom, Metro-Dade police called the Miami field office of the FBI for assistance, and the case went to Special Agent John Gill.
The FBI was involved from the very onset. The very fact that a large ransom was demanded caused it to fall into the jurisdiction of what we call the Hobbs Act.
The Hobbs Act makes extortion affecting interstate commerce a federal crime, and Mr. Portela's business reached across state lines. Agents from the FBI's reactive squad installed recording equipment on Mr. Portela's office and home phones, and arranged to have all incoming calls traced. The next day, Special Agent Gill wanted to talk with Jesus Portela, but not at the trailer or at home. He asked Jesus to meet him at an empty garage. Agents watched the entrances and exits of the garage for any sign of the kidnappers, but did not see anyone. As far as they could tell, it was safe for Gill to question Mr. Portela.
Portela. Yes. My name is John Gill. Your credentials, sir. I have been assigned the administrator of this kidnapping case.
The agent asked if Mr. Portela knew of anyone who had a grudge against him, or if he had ever been threatened. The worried father could think of only one minor incident. He said that 8 months earlier, a man and woman burst into his office. He knew the woman. Her name was Rose de Parias. She recently purchased a condominium from him and said she discovered her neighbor's payments were lower than hers. Mr. Portela explained that the difference was because the neighbor had obtained a better finance rate. It was between the buyer and the bank.
The payments were not made to him at all. The financier had paid for the condominium, and he was out of the picture, so to speak.
The two refused to accept the explanation. The man began threatening him, demanding that Portela refund the money. But there was nothing he could do. Before they left, Rose de Parias vowed she would get her money back, one way or another. Mr. Portela had reported the incident to police.
And the police talked to this particular woman and explained to her the circumstances of financing and interest payment, and she apologized, and Mr. Portela just assumed that this had all gone away.
Agents later tracked down Rose de Parias and learned she was living in another state during the kidnapping. When they confirmed her alibi, they ruled her out as a suspect. Investigators were getting worried. With each day that passes, the chances of finding a kidnapping victim alive drastically diminished. They hoped the kidnappers would call again. If they did, the reactive squad was prepared, having wired Jesus Portela's home and office with telephone tap and trace equipment.
Meet at his office, right? All right, I'll be there.
Special Agent Gil Orantia and other investigators needed to be there to monitor the calls and run the equipment. But getting into the home unseen would be tricky.
The initial calls and our indications were that they were watching his home, they being the kidnappers. We were concerned that they might be able to detect that I was coming in.
They needed Mr. Portella's help.
I was crouched in the back seat as we drove to his home. We went into the garage and then we went into the house. We wanted to be able to record the phone calls and be able to capture everything that was said to him regarding any ransom demands.
Agents and Metro-Dade detectives would take shifts, staying with the Portella family 24 hours a day. They briefed Jesus on how to handle the calls. He would be the lead in the effort to get his son back.
One of the things early on, obviously, was to determine if he's even alive or not. And we discussed with Mr. Portella some of the things that he could ask the kidnappers, which only Mario Portella would know, proof of life questions, if you would, that could come back to us to verify, yes, we know he's alive.
In building a profile of Mario, with details about his life, including favorite foods and names of pets, the agents got to know the young man.
Mario Portella was the all-American kid. He had gone to school. He had maintained outstanding grades. He had just gotten married to a young lady, and they were newlyweds with a bright future. Everybody loved him. The reason that this case was so traumatic for so many people is that so many people could identify with them. They were the type of family that we all aspire to be, and they were living the American dream, but they ran into a nightmare.
As promised, the kidnappers called 3 days after the abduction. The caller ordered Mr. Portella to listen to a taped recording. The voice on the tape was Mario. He pleaded with his father to pay the ransom money, warning the kidnappers were serious and would kill him if he called the police or the FBI. Jesus told the caller he had discreetly begun the process of securing the money from his bank. Agents reminded Mr. Portella to ask the proof-of-life questions, including what Mario's nickname was as a child and the name of the dog his wife used to have. The man agreed to call back with the answers. Mr. Portella had kept him on the line long enough for agents to trace the call to a Miami payphone. But the caller had gone before surveillance units arrived. In the harrowing days after the kidnapping, Mr. Portella received several other calls. Speaking in Spanish, a different man talked vaguely and mysteriously of a business proposition apparently unrelated to the abduction.
The demeanor of Mr. Portella at the time was, I really don't have time to talk to you about business because I have other problems. This individual indicated on several calls that he, in fact, was a person that could help solve the problems. His persistence in trying to communicate his involvement in whatever Mr. Portella's problem was caused us to be highly suspicious that somehow he was playing a role or a part in the kidnapping or the ransom demands.
Jesus kept the man on the line, and investigators pinpointed the source of the call. It was coming from the same area as the kidnapper's earlier call. Surveillance units made it to the scene in time to spot the person on the phone. They followed him to a fast food restaurant, where he emerged with a takeout bag. From their biographical profile of Mario, investigators knew the restaurant's burgers were his favorite. They then followed the man to an apartment complex, where his behavior was even more suspicious.
When he took the hamburgers to an apartment and delivered them through the door, having no conversation with the recipient, and this was the brand of hamburgers that Mario and his father fancied, yes, at that point we were suspicious that perhaps Mario was being held at that location.
A SWAT team responded and set up outside the apartment. The clock was ticking. They needed to find Mario. In Miami, the FBI and Metro-Dade police were trying to find Mario Portela and whoever kidnapped him. Their first good lead brought them to a Miami apartment where they believed the kidnappers might be holding Mario. The SWAT team quickly secured the apartment and searched each of its rooms. But Mario was not there. It had been a false lead for FBI Special Agent John Gill.
It was determined not only by search, but interview of the people there, that they were not related or associated with the kidnapping whatsoever.
Interviewing the caller, agents determined he knew nothing of the abduction and was merely trying to get work with Mr. Portela's company. Investigators again were forced to wait for the kidnappers to make the next move. It was the original caller. He answered the proof of life questions correctly, suggesting Mario might still be alive.
That's correct.
And again demanded $3 million. As instructed, Jesus tried to keep the caller on the line. He said he had spoken to the bank and could only come up with 1/3 of the amount. As Mr. Portela negotiated, agents traced the call to another Miami payphone. Units were on their way. Eventually, the caller agreed to $1 million. Trying to stall longer, Mr. Portela said it would take time to get the money since the bank was closed for the night. But the man ordered him to have it ready when he called back in 3 hours with instructions for the drop. Once again, he disappeared before authorities could arrive. Within the hour, Mr. Portela met plainclothes agents at his bank.
Looks like it's all here. You go ahead and sign for it.
There, the FBI recorded the serial numbers of the bills that made up the $1 million ransom, so they could be traced when the kidnappers spent them.
Good. Okay, gentlemen?
Yes?
Thank you. Thank you.
At the Portela home, agents hid a tracking device in the briefcase, hoping it would lead them to wherever Mario was being held.
Yes. Speaking.
The kidnappers called on schedule and gave Mr. Portela directions for the ransom drop. They ordered him to drive to a local restaurant, leave the car door unlocked with the money inside, wait for a call at a certain payphone, then go into the restaurant and sit down. The caller warned Jesus to go alone. With the loaded briefcases, Jesus began the trip. It took less than half an hour, but to the worried father, it must have seemed an eternity. The restaurant was in a tough and dangerous part of Miami. Undercover agents and Metro-Dade detectives were already there, watching. Agents also manned an empty apartment with a view of the restaurant. Jesus Portela arrived, carrying $1 million in cash and hoping finally to get his son back. But he would soon discover that nothing was as the kidnappers said it would be. Jesus Portela was on his way to deliver $1 million ransom in an unsafe part of Miami, hoping to get his son Mario back. The way he handled the troubling and dangerous situation impressed the investigators working with him, including FBI Special Agent Gil Orantia.
For him to have endured what he did, I have all the respect for him in the world. He performed very, very well. He did the things we asked him to. He did things that probably most of us couldn't do.
The FBI and Metro-Dade police had undercover personnel staking out the restaurant. But the place was closed, and Jesus began to wonder if it was a setup. He found a payphone, though not where the kidnappers said it would be. He was nervous about leaving his car unlocked with $1 million in it. He hoped the kidnappers would call before anything happened to him. If thieves made off with the money, he might never see his son again.
Waiting for a phone call, is that all right? You got to be around this area. Well, I'm waiting for a phone call. Don't you have something better to do? Keep going.
Though he waited, the phone call never came. Eventually, Jesus had to leave with the ransom money, but without Mario. He and the investigators spent days waiting for the kidnappers to call again with new instructions.
There were no ransom calls that came after the drop failed. We were concerned at that point because obviously our only connection to them were the phone calls. That was our connection to the bad guys. That was our ability to do something about what they were doing. And when they stopped calling, we became very worried.
Although the kidnappers were not leaving new clues with ransom calls, older clues were beginning to pay off. FBI Special Agent John Hanlon was trying to find the car used in Mario's abduction. It was an older blue and gray four-door Chevrolet sedan and had temporary dealer tags, which were not in DMV databases at the time.
And of course, with a paper tag, it can't be traced, so the car looks perfectly legitimate and doesn't draw the attention of law enforcement.
Hanlon knew used car dealerships sometimes illegally rented cars that were for sale, placing temporary tags on them. He began phoning every dealership in the area. The time-consuming work paid off when Hanlon spoke to a clerk at one dealership in Miami.
I asked her, "You rent any old cars?" And she said, "Sure, you know, and any old with paper tags?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Any old Chevys?" She said, "Yeah." I asked her, I said, "Any blue and gray ones?" She said, "Yeah." I says, "Where is it?" She says, "It's here." And I said, "Well, when was it rented?" And she says, August the 7th. And I'm thinking, oh my God.
August 7th was the day of the kidnapping. When agents discovered the car had been returned the next day, they impounded it to have it searched for evidence. Metro-Dade forensics technicians processed the vehicle. They found no usable hair, fiber, or fingerprint evidence. But they did find a keychain under the back seat. The FBI knew that Mario Portella drove a Volvo.
So we barreled back over there, picked up the keys. We showed them to the family members. Of course, they identified them. It also fit his automobile, and we took it by the house, and the house key fit his home.
It meant that vehicle was most likely used to abduct Mario Portella. Checking records, agents learned a woman named Julita de Parias had rented the car. The clerk at the dealership said the woman came in with a man she said was her brother. Hanlon requested driver's license photos of Julita de Parias and her siblings. 9 days after the abduction, Hanlon met with the clerk who had rented out the car, showing her a photo lineup that included a picture of Julita de Parias, along with several decoy pictures. The clerk identified Julita de Parias immediately.
Are you sure? Positive. Okay, let me ask you, would you look at it? I mean, you had seen this individual before. I'd like you to take a look at it.
The clerk also identified the man who was with her. It was Julita's brother, Julio. Agents were familiar with the De Parias name. They remembered Rose De Parias was the woman who had had the dispute with Mr. Portela the previous year. Julita was Rose's sister. They now believed Julio De Parias was the man who accompanied Rose and threatened Jesus. Although the FBI still ruled out any involvement by Rose De Parias, her siblings were now prime suspects.
Once we had good suspects in this investigation, we put surveillance on some of the members in an attempt to gather more evidence.
The FBI noticed an unidentified man usually accompanied Julita. The couple seemed to be romantically involved. It had been 10 days since the abduction. Agents hoped the suspects would lead them to Mario Portela. They needed to question them, but doing so would alert any accomplices and put Mario's life at risk.
We couldn't exactly jump them at that moment because we were trying to rescue this young man. That was our primary objective, to get this young man back to his family. So we continued to watch them.
The FBI and Metro-Dade's surveillance effort included air and ground units. But the suspects seemed to be wary of a tail.
They were very erratic and paranoid in their behavior. Their driving would go in one direction and make a U-turn and go in another direction and then go through a parking lot and then in another direction, which was very taxing on our ability to surveil, in as much as you only have a limited number of automobiles to conduct a surveillance, and when you're passing by the same subject 3 and 4 times in the course of one trip, the chances of being identified as a surveilling vehicle are great.
The suspects' counter-surveillance techniques worked. Following them exhausted the helicopter's fuel supply, forcing agents to turn back. Ground units tried to remain undetected and keep the suspects in sight, but soon they lost them. It was a difficult blow to the investigation. 3 days later, and 25 miles north of Miami, in the town of Davie, Florida, 2 teenagers were walking in a field when they made a grim discovery that would provide terrible answers to a family hoping for the best. 13 days after Mario Portela was kidnapped, teenagers discovered a body in Davie, Florida, 25 miles north of Miami. Davie police realized it was a murder. The man's head was completely wrapped with duct tape. Detective Ed Taylor faced the challenge of identifying the victim.
All we knew at that time was it was a male. We didn't know how old he was because his entire head had been taped. His hands had been taped behind his back and his ankles had been taped together as well. So at the scene, we really didn't have very much information as to the identity of the victim or how old he was or anything of that nature.
They needed to examine the body, tape, and sleeping bag for more clues and remove the evidence to the controlled environment of the lab. Dr. James Ongley, then Associate Medical Examiner for Broward County, performed the autopsy. He removed the duct tape surrounding the head, careful to preserve each tear and section for later analysis by forensics technicians. With the tape off, Dr. Ongley could describe the victim as male, between the ages of 20 and 40, 5 foot 9 inches tall, with brown eyes and brown hair. Although the victim had been severely beaten, The cause of death was asphyxiation. He believed the man had been dead for 24 to 36 hours. To aid in identification, Dr. Ongley photographed the victim for comparison with photos of missing persons. But he knew the pictures would not be accurate representations of the victim. The tightly wrapped duct tape had distorted facial features, and the summer heat caused significant decomposition.
We took fingerprints from the victim so we could submit them to other departments to see if he had ever been arrested before. We did a press release to the various newspapers with a description of the victim and ran a photograph of the victim to see if anyone could identify him.
On August 25th, a Miami newspaper ran an article about the body found in Davie. FBI Special Agent John Gill noted the description loosely matched that of Mario Portela and immediately contacted the Davie Police Department about the abducted man.
We had received prior dental records of Mario Portela from his family dentist, and those records were in evidence at the FBI office in the event that they were needed to identify a victim. Those records were brought to Davie, Florida. I met with Detective Taylor, and we both proceeded then to the Broward County Medical Examiner's Office. Dr. Ongley was then capable, with his experience, to take those dental films or x-rays and compare them to the body and positively identify that body as being our victim, Mario Portela.
For everyone trying to bring Mario home to his family, the news was devastating.
We had to notify the Portela family that the victim had been identified and deceased.
Now agents were investigating a murder. Reviewing the complex case, they outlined their suspects. Julio de Parias, the man who had threatened Jesus Portela the previous year. His sister Julita, whose name appeared on the rental contract for the abduction vehicle. And the man agents believed to be her boyfriend. All three had disappeared. Agents also developed another suspect, Hector de Parias, Julio and Julita's brother. He was close to his siblings and had a criminal record. Now, with no chance of finding Mario alive, the FBI's investigation could be overt. They interviewed the sister of three of the suspects, Rose de Parias, who had threatened Jesus Portela 8 months before the kidnapping. She denied any involvement and offered her full cooperation. She said Julita's boyfriend was Jesse Ramirez, and that if he and the others could not be found in Miami, they most likely went to Los Angeles, where they had friends. Miami agents forwarded the lead to the Los Angeles field office. There, Special Agent Gregory Pack knew they had no time to lose.
It was imperative to find these people as soon as possible because they are dangerous people, and they are people you don't want on the streets in your city or anybody else's city. If they did this once, kidnapped and murdered, what's to say that they wouldn't do it a second time to some other victim?
Special Agent Pack needed to narrow the scope of the search. He knew the suspects were of Colombian descent, and LA's Rampart district had a large Colombian population.
I went out there with these very good photographs, and I went to all the places that you and I would have to go to occasionally in a normal course of living. Dry cleaners, restaurants, hotels, motels, apartments. After a couple weeks of this door-to-door canvassing, I ran across a lady who was the apartment manager. I showed her the photographs.
She recognized Hector, Julita, and Julio de Parias as new tenants, but said they seemed to be rarely at home.
So I left my card with her and asked her if she would call me. And I called her at least once a day. This went on for probably 8 or 10 days. Finally, in the evening, about 9 o'clock, I received a call from the office, and this apartment manager was on the line and wanted to be patched through to me. So I accepted the call, and she told me that the people that I had been looking for were in the apartment now. We approached the apartment house, took up various positions so there wouldn't be any escape out the windows or other doors. And as we ran in the front door, there was a gentleman pointing a revolver at us. So we tackled him, wrestled the gun from him, took him into custody, and then there was another person there.
The man with the gun was Julita's boyfriend, Jesse Ramirez. He was held on charges of assaulting a federal officer. The other man in the room was Hector de Parias, Julita and Julio's brother. He was held on a parole violation for drug possession and burglary. 2 suspects were in custody, but 2 were still at large.
We knew Julita and Julio were still outstanding. So when we left, I had 2 agents remain at the apartment. Several hours later, Julita came back. She was taken into custody, and then she was brought down to FBI headquarters in Los Angeles.
Agents waited for Julio de Parias, but he never showed. The case agent in Miami, John Gill, learned of the arrests.
Gregory Pack, the special agent in the Los Angeles division, called our division here in Miami. I was immediately on an airplane the morning of the telephone call, met with Agent Pack at approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Los Angeles, where I briefed him on our experience and knowledge of the case.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias refused to talk to investigators. But Special Agent Gill and Davie, Florida Police Detective Ed Taylor had more success with Hector de Parias. They needed his help to find the 4th suspect, Julio de Parias. And they needed to know the details of Mario Portella's last days. On September 24th, 1984, the FBI apprehended 3 suspects in the kidnapping and murder of Mario Portella. But a 4th suspect, Julio de Parias, was still at large. Only one of the 3 in custody, Hector de Parias, agreed to talk. Still, he was evasive at first, and investigators caught him in several lies. Davie Police Detective Ed Taylor and FBI Special Agent John Gill decided on the soft approach to get the truth.
We befriended him in this style of interrogation, realizing that the potential was there to develop trust and cause him to, in a sense, confess.
So that we know
on the second day of interrogation,
did play a part. And you know that
he became cooperative to the point that he was right on the edge of divulging his criminality.
Tell me, Hector.
As he became more trustful of Mr. Taylor and I, he advised us that, yes, he would cooperate and divulge details. He was not involved in the abduction, but several days after the abduction, Mario was being held captive in an apartment. The brother, sister, and the sister's paramour discovered that maintaining guard on a kidnapped victim is a lot of trouble, and they needed help. And they knew that Hector was available, that he was unemployed, that he was addicted to marijuana, could not get a job, and in fact would jump at an opportunity to participate in a venture with financial gain. So they solicited his help to watch a victim, as he put it.
According to Hector, the motive for the kidnapping was actually revenge. Julio de Parias felt humiliated that he could not force Mr. Portella to refund his sister's money after she purchased her condominium. Hector said that after several days, his brother Julio and Jesse Ramirez worried about getting caught and gave up on trying for a ransom. They decided they had to get rid of the only link to them, Mario Portela. So on August 17th, 1984, 10 days after the kidnapping, they decided to murder him. Jesse Ramirez began wrapping Mario Portela's head with duct tape as he pleaded for his life and prayed. As Mario struggled to breathe, Jesse beat him with a metal bar. After the murder, Julio de Parias paid Jesse Ramirez $1,000 for the job. Hector claimed to have no idea of Julio's whereabouts, but he did know where Mario was held and murdered.
Hector not only was able to give us an address of an apartment complex and the building unit, Hector was even able to draw us a diagram of the interior of the apartment, where the various rooms were, furniture, where the murder had taken place.
A team of agents, detectives, and forensics technicians rushed to the apartment in Miami. They secured it as a crime scene and processed it for clues. Any evidence recovered might help put Mario's killers behind bars. But seeing it brought back to investigators the disappointment of not being able to save the young man's life. Special Agent Gil Orantia was there.
As we entered this apartment, we saw a roll of duct tape on the side of a nightstand. We saw a bar that we believe was used to strike Mario with. We saw blood in the apartment. We saw all of these things that sort of put this thing, for us, evidentiary-wise, together. But it was a difficult thing to look at. It was a situation where, you know, our goal was to do the right thing and get him saved, and we couldn't do it. And it was tough. It was tough for us to look at that.
In addition to duct tape, investigators found pieces of adhesive medical tape in the room. They also recovered hair and fiber evidence. Everything was cataloged and sent to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. There, Special Agent Hal Dedman of the FBI's Trace Evidence Unit analyzed the items.
My involvement in the case dealt with the comparison of hairs, textile fibers, and tape from the 4 locations: the body recovery site, the apartment where the victim was held, a car that the body was transported in, and another apartment where clothing from one of the suspects was recovered.
He matched carpet fibers from those locations to samples found on the suspects and the victim. He also compared the tape wrapped around the victim's head, arms, and legs to the rolls of tape recovered at the murder scene.
If you have 2 pieces of tape that were once original or adjoining sections of the same piece of tape, and that tape is torn, the yarns are not all going to have the same appearance, they're not going to have the same length. You'll have short pieces and long pieces. And you can fit these pieces of tape together much like you'd fit pieces together in a jigsaw puzzle.
Special Agent Dedman determined the tear on the roll of tape from the apartment was a perfect fit with a piece of tape recovered from the victim's head. He also compared the tears on a strip of medical tape found on suspect Jesse Ramirez's shoes to those on the roll of medical tape found in the apartment and to those on a piece from the victim's body. It was another exact match.
Each piece of evidence contributed, and the result was that there was a tremendously strong association between the suspects in this case and the victim.
Jesse Ramirez and Julita de Parias were found guilty on kidnapping, extortion, and murder charges. Both were sentenced to life in prison. Hector de Parias pleaded guilty to the same charges and received 40 years. But the fourth suspect, Julio de Parias, was still out there.
We believed that he could have fled to Latin America somewhere. So we printed up wanted flyers that you'd find in your post office, in police departments. We sent them all over the place, and we developed the same ones in Spanish, and we distributed them throughout Latin America.
Almost 4 years after the kidnapping, in November of 1988, the FBI learned Costa Rican customs officials were holding a man who resembled the photo of Julio de Parias in the FBI's wanted poster. Special Agent Orantia flew to Costa Rica. The man did look like the photo, but it was his voice, the one from the ransom calls, that tipped Orantia off.
I had listened to those phone calls over and over and over again, hundreds of times. I knew that voice. That voice was a part of me as much as anything's a part of me. So at the moment he opened his mouth, that was it. That was it. It cinched it. I knew it was him.
The federal trial of Julio de Parias began 5 years to the day after Mario Portella's abduction. He was convicted of kidnapping, extortion, and murder, and sentenced to life. For the FBI agents who had gotten to know the victim's family, the convictions were important, but not the ending they had expected.
This was a horrendous crime. For some type of justice not to come out of it would have been difficult for the community in Miami and for the family, and I'll be honest with you, for us too, the agents. So I think the idea that some type of justice occurred is paramount. That's the only thing we can cling to, all of us, that at least they were caught.
The Portella family has persevered. They will never forget Mario, and they have not given up their dream.